It began with silence, the kind that comes not from peace, but from anticipation, the moment before a thunderclap, when the air hangs heavy and charged. Cameras blinked red in the studio, and the overhead lights bathed the set in a sterile glow. Producers behind the glass whispered into headsets, their eyes darting across multiple screens. America was watching. Millions of viewers tuned into what had been billed as a routine political panel, but what unfolded would etch itself into public memory as something far more gripping. A clash not of parties, but of principles, pasts, and power. The tension on set crackled as Kellyanne Conway leaned forward in her seat, eyes narrowed like a hawk circling prey. Her voice, sharp and polished by decades in the political arena, sliced through the air. "You don't know what you're talking about." She spat, her finger stabbing toward her fellow guest, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. "You've never had to carry the weight of running a campaign under fire. You just show up, read your little scripts, and think you're making history." The outburst sent a shiver across the studio. The host froze. The other panelists stiffened, unsure whether to step in or let the moment combust on its own. For a breathless second, no one moved, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat with her spine straight, hands folded in her lap, her eyes steady and clear as still water. Then she turned her head slowly, met Kellyanne's gaze, and in a voice barely above a whisper, said, "I don't scream to be heard, Kellyanne. I work, I listen, and I carry the stories of people you've never taken the time to understand." The room went still. Outside the studio, the world would replay that moment for days. But inside, what the cameras didn't show, what viewers couldn't know, were the two lives colliding in that exchange. Two stories that had taken very different roads to the same platform. Kellyanne Conway had been a fixture in the conservative political world for decades. A Jersey girl with grit in her blood and a knack for turning chaos into strategy. She'd spent years carving her path through the patriarchal maze of Washington. She was brilliant, no doubt. But her brilliance had been forged in fire, working class roots, a single mother who cleaned offices at night, and the constant pressure to be the smartest person in the room or risk being forgotten. She learned early that vulnerability was a luxury, and she'd never once allowed herself the indulgence of self-doubt. But beneath her confident exterior, the years had taken their toll. The political wars, the betrayals, the lies she sometimes told even herself, they wore on her like old armor. The rise of new voices like Jasmine's felt like a challenge, not just to her politics, but to her legacy, and that terrified her in ways she couldn't admit. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, had never asked for a spotlight, but when it came, she refused to shy from it. Born and raised in Dallas, she had come up in a community that taught her the value of grit and grace. Her father had worked 3 jobs, and her mother, a schoolteacher, had poured her heart into other people's children even when she was stretched thin. Jasmine had been a quiet child, always listening, always watching. She studied law not because she loved the game, but because she saw how often the rules were written to exclude people who looked like her. Her first taste of public life came when she represented protesters during the George Floyd uprisings. In courtrooms thick with tension, she'd stood firm, calm, and deliberate the same way she did on the panel now. Her rise to Congress had come fast, too fast for some, but she carried herself with a stillness that came from years of walking into rooms where she wasn't expected to belong and refusing to shrink. Their clash that day on TV wasn't really about policy. It was about something deeper, the collision of two ways of wielding power. One forged in fire, one rooted in patience. One shouting to survive, one speaking softly to build. The conversation had started cordially enough, a discussion about the upcoming election, voter outreach, the direction of the country. But as Jasmine spoke of disenfranchised voters, systemic inequality, and the importance of building trust beyond party lines, something in Kellyanne had snapped. "I've actually been on the front lines," she had barked. "You talk about community, but I've had to negotiate real power. That's where change happens. You think power is change." Jasmine replied calmly, "But power without empathy is just noise." And with that, the simmering heat exploded into that now infamous moment, Kellyanne screaming, Jasmine sitting still. But the story didn't end on air. Later that night, Jasmine sat in her hotel room overlooking the city. Her phone buzzed nonstop, texts from staff, messages from supporters, news clips already circulating. She turned the phone face down and stared out at the skyline. In her chest, something throbbed, not pride, not anger, but a weight. She hadn't wanted to embarrass Kellyanne. She just couldn't let the moment pass. There were girls back home in Oak Cliff who would see that clip and feel like they could take up space, speak softly, and still be heard. That mattered more than the headlines. Meanwhile, in her own quiet suite across town, Kellyanne poured a glass of white wine and sat in the dim glow of the television, replaying the moment. She watched herself yelling, watched Jasmine's stillness. A strange ache settled in her gut, not regret exactly, but something close. She thought of her daughter, Claudia, now grown and distant. She thought of the fights they'd had, the things she couldn't unsay. For the first time in years, Kellyanne wondered if maybe power wasn't the only way to win. The next morning, both women woke to a country buzzing. Clips of the exchange had gone viral, but it was Jasmine's calm reply that caught fire, quoted, remixed, set to music, even painted on murals in cities from Chicago to L.A. But beyond the fame, something deeper was happening. Young women across the country, especially black and brown women, found something sacred in Jasmine's stillness. "I don't scream to be heard," became more than a quote. It became a rallying cry for those who had been talked over, underestimated, and ignored. It wasn't weakness, it was resistance, measured, mature, grounded, and for Kellyanne, a quiet reckoning began. Days later, she wrote a column, not an apology, but a reflection. She talked about the hunger to be seen, the cost of always being on the attack, the moments in her career when she wished she had paused long enough to listen. She didn't name Jasmine, but the message was clear. Sometimes, she wrote, it takes grace to undo what rage has built. In the weeks that followed, the two women didn't speak directly, but a few months later, at a summit on women in leadership, they shared the same stage again. Jasmine, walking past, nodded respectfully. Kellyanne paused, then reached out her hand. Jasmine shook it firm, no performance. Just two women who had chosen different paths, crossing again under softer lights. The lesson wasn't in the clash. It was in what followed. Two women, flawed, fierce, and human, showing that dignity doesn't always wear the loudest voice. That legacy is not written in who speaks over whom, but in who listens when it matters most. And maybe, just maybe, in that quiet moment, the country learned something too.